Grace Turner, the epitome of elegance, and Luke Matthews, her daughter Emily's boyfriend, never expected their secret to unravel the way it did. On the surface, the Turner family seemed perfect: a loving father, a devoted mother, and a daughter with a bright future. But when Emily stumbled upon the truth, everything they had built together came crashing down in a shocking confrontation that would change their lives forever. Betrayal, lies, and a tragic murder would soon follow, leaving the once perfect family broken beyond repair. How far can a mother and her daughter's boyfriend go before the truth destroys everything? In the small, quiet town of Maplewood, the Turner family appeared to have it all. The house on Elm Street was a picturesque two-story home with a white picket fence, a lush green garden, and an inviting front porch where neighbors often saw Thomas Turner sitting in a rocking chair, reading the newspaper on a Sunday morning. He was the kind of man people respected: diligent, kind-hearted, and successful. Thomas ran a well-established real estate business, which made him a familiar face in the town's social circles. He had built his reputation from the ground up, and many looked up to him as the ideal family man. His wife, Grace, was a striking woman in her early 40s with a natural elegance that made her the centerpiece of any social gathering. Grace was the embodiment of grace itself, always composed, always poised, and with a smile that could light up a room. She was involved in various charitable endeavors and regularly attended meetings at the community center. Her reputation was impeccable, and she had an air of sophistication that made her the envy of many of the other women in town. Their daughter, Emily, was a 19-year-old college student who everyone thought had the world at her feet. She was intelligent, hard-working, and had a bright future ahead of her. Emily was a straight-A student, involved in extracurricular activities, and well-liked by her friends and teachers alike. She often came home to a warm meal prepared by her mother, and her father, Thomas, would make a point to spend time with her every weekend, whether it was watching a movie together or going for long walks in the nearby park. Though the Turners appeared to be the ideal family, cracks began to show beneath the surface as time went on. Grace, despite her outwardly perfect life, was becoming increasingly dissatisfied. Her marriage with Thomas had, over the years, grown routine. He was often away on business, leaving Grace to manage the household and her own growing sense of loneliness. She had tried to fill the void with social engagements, volunteering, and charity work, but nothing seemed to bring her the fulfillment she longed for. It was during this time of emotional unrest that Luke Matthews entered the scene. Luke, a 22-year-old college dropout, had recently moved to Maplewood to live with his aunt after his own family fell apart. He was charming, attractive, and had an air of youthful confidence that caught the attention of Grace. He had started dating Emily about a year earlier, and while their relationship seemed innocent enough at first, something shifted between Luke and Grace as the months passed. Luke's visits to the Turner home became more frequent, and at first it was just casual conversation over dinner. Grace was always polite and welcoming, but soon she began to notice that Luke's presence filled a gap she hadn't even realized existed. His attentiveness and humor were a stark contrast to Thomas's increasingly distant demeanor. Luke would linger after dinner, chatting with Grace while Emily went to her room to study. What started as friendly exchanges began to feel more intimate. Luke, ever the flirt, would compliment Grace on her looks, her intelligence, and her taste in home decor. It made her feel seen, appreciated in ways that had become unfamiliar in her marriage. The friendship between Grace and Luke gradually evolved into something more. Their conversations became longer, more personal. They shared secrets, both small and large, bonding over their personal struggles and unmet desires. As the weeks went by, These late-night talks became something Grace began to look forward to. She felt a spark of life return, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Oh. Unbeknownst to Emily, her mother and her boyfriend were becoming closer than anyone could have imagined. Grace justified the growing attraction, telling herself it was harmless. Luke, on the other hand, was intrigued by Grace's beauty and maturity. His feelings for Emily had always been somewhat superficial, but he saw an opportunity in Grace, an opportunity not only to satisfy his desires, but also to gain a foothold in the Turner family's wealth and social standing. As time went on, he found himself more and more drawn to her, not just emotionally, but physically as well. The affair had begun without either of them fully acknowledging what was happening, but deep down, both Grace and Luke knew they were crossing a line that would eventually lead to something far darker than either of them had anticipated. It was a secret they both kept hidden, one that would slowly unravel the fragile foundation of the Turner family. And as they continued to meet in secret, the perfect image of the Turner family would soon be shattered beyond repair. The affair between Grace and Luke began to take on a life of its own, a dangerous secret that neither of them could ignore. What had started as casual flirtation had quickly evolved into something much deeper and more reckless. Luke's visits to the Turner home became frequent, sometimes multiple times a week, always under the pretense of spending time with Emily. But more and more, he found himself alone with Grace. Their conversations became longer, more intimate, as they continued to confide in each other. Grace, for the first time in years, felt desired in a way that she hadn't in her marriage. Luke, with his youthful energy and attention, made her feel alive, as though she was seen not just as a mother or a wife, but as a woman in her own right. It was an intoxicating feeling, one that Grace struggled to suppress. The guilt, at first, was overwhelming, but as their encounters became more frequent, she began to convince herself that she deserved this. Thomas, who was often away on business trips, had become emotionally distant over the years. His long hours at work left little room for their relationship to grow, and Grace had often found herself alone in the evenings, staring out the window as she waited for him to come home. The silence between them was deafening, and in that silence, Luke's attention felt like a much-needed reprieve. Luke, on the other hand, saw the affair as both a chance for excitement and an opportunity for advancement. He had never quite fit in with Emily's world, the world of college students, books, and endless expectations. He was a dropout, drifting from one place to the next, never truly settling. But the Turner family, with its wealth and respectability, presented an opportunity that he couldn't resist. Grace had given him something he wanted, but he realized that there was more at play here. He could move up in life, possibly even secure a position of power if he played his cards right. What started as an attraction to Grace soon became more about what he could gain from the situation. While Grace and Luke continued their secret meetings, Emily remained unaware of the growing tension beneath the surface. At first, everything seemed normal. She continued to spend her days at college and her evenings at home with her parents. But little things began to bother her, small signs that something wasn't quite right. Her mother, once her closest confidant, had become distant. Grace no longer asked about Emily's day or offered the same warmth she once did. The family dinners that were once filled with conversation now felt forced and awkward. Grace would often retreat to her room early, leaving Emily and Thomas to finish their meals in silence. It was during this time that Emily started noticing Luke's behavior more closely. He had always been a bit of an enigma, but lately there was something unsettling about the way he acted around Grace. He would linger too long when saying goodbye, touch her arm in ways that felt overly intimate. There were moments when Emily would catch him looking at her mother with an expression that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just affection anymore, it was something else. Emily, though deeply uncomfortable, brushed it off, thinking it was just her imagination running wild. After all, she trusted Luke. He was her boyfriend. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, while Emily was studying in her room, she overheard a conversation between her parents that sent a chill down her spine. Grace and Thomas were discussing something trivial, but it was the way Grace spoke, distant, detached, that caught Emily's attention. She could hear her mother's voice, not filled with warmth or affection, but with a coldness she had never heard before. Emily's stomach turned as she listened to the conversation, her mind racing. She had always known there was tension between her parents, but this felt different. Later that night, after dinner, Emily retreated to her room, but her thoughts kept drifting back to what she had overheard. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. Something was off, and she needed to figure out what it was. The next day, she found herself paying more attention to the interactions between Grace and Luke. She watched them during family gatherings, at social events, and even at casual moments when they didn't think anyone was watching. It was subtle at first, just fleeting looks exchanged, a touch of the hand here and there. But as the days went on, Emily began to feel a growing sense of dread. Her mother and her boyfriend had crossed a line, and she was beginning to piece together the unthinkable. The signs were all there, but Emily wasn't ready to confront the truth yet. Instead, she tried to bury her suspicions, hoping it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the truth was becoming undeniable. What Emily had suspected was no longer a figment of her imagination. The affair was real, and it was happening right under her nose. The perfect family she had known all her life was unraveling, and she could feel the walls closing in. Emily's suspicions grew with each passing day, festering in the back of her mind like a slow-burning fire. She could no longer ignore the signs, and as much as she tried to push the thoughts away, they only became more persistent. Her once idyllic view of her family, of her mother and Luke, was rapidly slipping away. The unease that had been gnawing at her was now impossible to ignore. The way Luke looked at her mother, the lingering touches, the long hours they spent together when Emily wasn't around. All of it was too much to chalk up to coincidence. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon, when Emily returned home early from a study session at the library. She had planned to surprise her mother with a homemade lunch, a gesture she thought would bring them closer again. Grace had been so distant lately, and Emily longed for things to go back to the way they had been. She pulled into the driveway and noticed that Luke's car was parked in the garage. Even though Emily knew he wasn't supposed to be there that day, her heart skipped a beat, but she tried to brush off her growing anxiety. When she opened the front door, she heard laughter coming from the living room. Her first instinct was to assume it was Luke and her mother, joking around in the way they always had when they were alone. But something about the sound of their voices, the familiarity in the laughter, unsettled her. Emily stood in the doorway, frozen, unable to move for a moment. The laughter stopped abruptly as she stepped further into the house, and she found herself face to face with a scene she wasn't prepared for. There on the couch sat Grace and Luke, too close. Grace's head was resting on Luke's shoulder, her eyes closed in quiet contentment. It was the kind of gesture that should have been shared between a couple, not between a woman in her 40s and her daughter's boyfriend. The moment seemed to stretch on forever as Emily stood frozen, her mind unable to fully process what she was seeing. Grace quickly pulled away, her eyes wide with shock, as if she had just been caught in the middle of something she hadn't intended for anyone to see. Luke, too, looked startled, though his reaction was more controlled. a subtle smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. But Emily wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on her mother. The warmth, the affection that had once radiated between them was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing betrayal. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as the weight of what she had just witnessed settled in. Grace scrambled to sit up straight, brushing her hair out of her face with a nervous laugh. "Emily, I didn't hear you come in," she stammered. But the words felt empty, hollow. Luke's eyes shifted nervously between the two women, and for the first time, Emily saw him for what he truly was. Not the charming, fun boyfriend she had once admired, but someone capable of something much darker. She couldn't speak. Words caught in her throat, the shock rendering her momentarily mute. She turned and walked out of the room, tears welling up in her eyes. She needed air, space, but most of all she needed to escape the suffocating reality that her mother, the one person she had always looked up to, was no better than anyone else who had ever betrayed her. Emily fled to the backyard, her body trembling as the adrenaline surged through her veins. She couldn't breathe. The world around her spun as she tried to collect her thoughts. How had it come to this? How had the woman who had raised her, loved her, become the person who would betray her trust in such a way? She felt a deep sense of loss, as if the foundation of her entire world had cracked open and left her standing on unstable ground. It took her a long time to steady herself. She had to process what she had seen, had to understand that the perfect family she had believed in was nothing more than a facade. Her mother's affair with Luke was real, and now she had to face it. Emily's heart was breaking, but there was no time to mourn. There was something inside her now, a deep, growing anger that demanded answers. Her mind raced, running through every moment she had spent with her mother and Luke. All the times Grace had seemed distracted, all the subtle changes in their behavior, now clicked into place. Emily had been blind to it, unwilling to see the truth, but now it was painfully clear. It was time to confront them. But not just her mother. Luke, too. He had betrayed her trust in the worst way possible, and she could no longer allow this to continue without facing the truth. The betrayal cut deep, but Emily knew that confrontation was the only way forward. She had to know why this had happened. She needed to understand the lies, the manipulation, and the cruelty that had driven both of them to destroy the life they had all shared, and once the truth came to light, there would be no going back. Emily spent the next few days in a state of emotional turmoil. Her once peaceful world had been shattered, and she found herself drifting through her daily routines like a ghost. The reality of what she had witnessed, her mother and her boyfriend so brazenly crossing boundaries that were never meant to be broken, gnawed at her from the inside. It was hard to concentrate on anything else. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, but she told them nothing. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to burden anyone with the weight of what she now carried. The hours dragged on, each moment filled with the looming decision. How was she going to confront them? She could feel the anger building up inside her, a pressure that threatened to explode at any given moment. The question wasn't if she would confront them, but when. She had no intention of letting this betrayal slide, but she also knew that confronting Grace and Luke would likely tear her world apart even further. Would she be able to recover from this? Would there ever be a way to look at her mother, at Luke, the same way again? The more she thought about it, the more Emily realized there was no choice. She couldn't let them carry on with their lies. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful. The pain of silence was already unbearable, and she knew that she would never be able to move forward unless she faced it head on. Emily spent the next evening planning. She didn't want to do this alone, and so she called Megan, her closest friend, and told her everything. Megan was horrified by the news, but promised to be there for her. The idea of confronting Grace and Luke with someone else by her side gave Emily a small sense of strength, even if it felt like an impossible task. Megan was supportive but cautious, reminding Emily that the conversation could go in any number of directions. And finally, she needed to be prepared for anything. Emily agreed, though deep down she feared the worst. They planned to confront Grace and Luke together the following evening, when Thomas was out of town for another business trip. Emily knew it would be easier to speak freely without him there, even though she hated the idea of facing Grace alone with her accusations. But the truth could no longer stay buried. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Emily's nerves were on edge. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. Every part of her wanted to run, to avoid facing the reality of her broken family. But deep down, she knew she had to do this. For herself, for her dignity, for the sake of whatever family she still had left. When the time came, Emily and Megan arrived at the Turner home just as the sun began to set. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. She could hear Luke's voice faintly through the walls. He was there. He would be there when the truth came crashing down. Grace greeted them at the door, her expression flickering with surprise when she saw Megan. She didn't question it, though, assuming it was a casual visit. "Emily, Megan, what's going on?" she asked, though her tone lacked the warmth it once had. "Mom," Emily began, her voice wavering but determined. "We need to talk. Now." Grace's face immediately shifted. She had no idea what was coming, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, a tightening of the jaw. She looked to Luke, who had emerged from the living room, his usual confident smile replaced by something more guarded. Emily took a deep breath, gathering the remnants of her courage. "About you and Luke," Emily said, her words sharp, direct. "I know about the affair." There was a long, heavy silence. Luke's face blanched, and Grace's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, her breath catching in her throat. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Grace's eyes flickered to Luke for a brief moment, and that was enough to confirm everything. Emily saw it. It was real. The truth was out. "Emily, Grace began, but the words failed her. She looked at Megan, then back at Emily. She seemed to be searching for some kind of excuse, some way to explain it away, but she found none. "You're her boyfriend," Emily spat, her voice trembling with disgust. "How could you do this? How could you do this to me, to her?" Luke remained silent, but his eyes flickered nervously between the two women. His usual charm had evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating look of someone caught in a web of their own making. "It's not what you think, Emily," Grace finally said, but her voice sounded hollow, defeated. "I never meant for you to find out like this, but we didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened." It didn't matter what she said. The words felt empty. The betrayal cut too deep. Emily's chest tightened as a flood of emotions crashed through her. Anger, hurt, disbelief, all of it boiled over, and she had to fight the urge to scream. Instead, she turned to Luke. "You used me. You used me to get close to my mother, didn't you? You never cared about me, did you?" Her words were like venom, sharp, and bitter as they landed on him. Luke said nothing. There was no defense. He couldn't explain away what had happened, not when Emily had laid it bare in front of him. He had always been calculating, but now that the lie was exposed, he had nowhere to hide. Grace looked at Emily, her face crumpling in regret. "Emily, I am so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. But I don't know how it happened either." But Emily didn't want apologies. She didn't want explanations. She wanted answers, and none of them were good enough. Her world had come crashing down, and now she had to live with the fallout. The confrontation had left Emily feeling raw, exposed, and deeply shaken. She had expected the pain of betrayal, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of the words spoken in that room. Grace's apology felt like a futile attempt to stitch together a wound that was already too deep to heal. Luke's silence, his failure to even try to explain himself, only amplified the betrayal. For a few long moments after the truth came tumbling out, all Emily could do was stare at them, her heart heavy, her mind racing. Megan, standing at her side, seemed as lost as Emily in the aftermath. She had known this was going to be painful, but the reality of seeing her best friend's family unravel was almost more than she could bear. But she remained quiet, offering Emily the support she needed without saying a word. There was nothing anyone could say that could undo the damage. "I need to leave," Emily finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She couldn't stand to be in that house anymore. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with memories of a life she once knew, a life now fractured beyond repair. She turned on her heel, barely waiting for Megan to follow, before walking out the front door and into the cold night air. The world outside seemed so much clearer, but also infinitely colder. Emily could hear the distant hum of cars passing by, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, but none of it made her feel better. She couldn't stop the tears that spilled down her face, nor could she erase the image of her mother and Luke from her mind. The shame of being betrayed by both of them, the woman who had raised her, the man she had once loved, felt unbearable. The pain of their actions was compounded by the knowledge that her entire family had been built on lies. They didn't follow her. Grace didn't come rushing out of the house to explain, didn't chase after her daughter. It was as if Emily had already been lost to them, as though there was no coming back from the chasm that had formed between them. Luke didn't care enough to say a word. That thought stung more than anything. Luke had used her, manipulated her trust for his own gain. And the moment the truth was out, he had slinked back into the shadows. There was no apology, no remorse, just silence. Emily and Megan sat in the car, the cold seeping in through the windows as the silence between them grew heavier. Neither of them knew what to say. Words didn't seem adequate for the situation. Megan reached over, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. "I'm so sorry, Em. I can't imagine how hard this must be." "I don't know what to do," Emily choked out, her voice cracked with emotion. "Everything feels like it's falling apart. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I want to." Megan gave her a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to fix anything right now. You just have to take care of yourself. That's what matters." But Emily couldn't stop the storm inside her. She wanted answers, and she needed them now. But she also felt betrayed by the one person who had always been her rock. Grace had always been her mother, the person Emily had gone to with every problem, every fear. And now that same person had torn their relationship apart with a betrayal she could never undo. She couldn't imagine forgiving her, couldn't imagine ever trusting her again. All her life. In the days that followed, Emily distanced herself from both Grace and Luke. She stayed with Megan for a while, avoiding the house where everything had once felt safe. Thomas, unaware of the affair, tried to keep things normal, but Emily couldn't bring herself to speak to him, not when everything she knew was crumbling. She thought of telling him the truth, of exposing the affair, but the idea of destroying the man she had always seen as the pillar of her family seemed too much. In the end, though, she knew he deserved to know the truth. But even as Emily prepared to confront Thomas, the weight of what she had lost loomed large. The family she had once known, the warm dinners, the easy laughter, the Sunday mornings on the porch were gone. Everything had been corrupted by secrets, lies, and the choices of the two people she had trusted most. She couldn't undo the past, couldn't change what had happened, but Emily knew one thing. She had to move forward. She couldn't let this tear her apart. Her life had been shattered, yes, but it was hers to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, Emily found solace in rebuilding her sense of self, in focusing on her future. She cut off contact with both Grace and Luke, though the ache of their betrayal still lingered, often sharp and sudden. But each day brought a small piece of healing. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had, and in that, Emily realized that despite the pain, she could still carve out her own path, a path away from the shadows of betrayal and into the light of a future where she would never again be made to feel small or unimportant. Though the scars of the past would remain, Emily knew she was strong enough to endure, and that, in time, she would find her way back to happiness. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be her journey. The perfect family she had once known was gone, but she would rebuild her life, piece by piece.